Hey guys, so as I'm sure you're aware, at least those watching in the US, we have an election coming up, and obviously there's a lot to pour over with the actual vote here, but for today's video, I want to focus on something a little bit different, and that is the history of Survivor players that ran for political office. These are the people who used their 15 minutes of fame on the show to have a hand in the reins of government and make a difference in their communities. Now at the time of recording, we have had 7 Survivor players go on to run for political office after their time on Survivor, and in today's video, we'll be sharing their stories, who they are, and how successful they were in their political pursuits. And I know this isn't the type of video I normally make, but I feel like considering the time we are in, I figured it was at least interesting to look at this history. But we have 7 players to talk about, and as we wasting more time, let's get into the video. So the first Survivor player to throw their hat into the ring was Jolanda Jones from Survivor Palau. Jolanda's run on Survivor was interesting to say the least, where despite them having early success in winning the first individual immunity challenge in day 1 that allowed them to be the captain to pick their tribes, that tribe ended up being Oolong, one of the worst tribes in Survivor history, and sure enough, she was the first voted out of that ill-fated tribe. But despite only lasting 1 episode on the show, that didn't deter Jolanda from using her time on Survivor to climb the political ranks. And sure enough, in 2007, she was elected to a seat on the Houston City Council. But despite the first few years of her tenure being productive, in 2011, Jolanda was investigated for ethics violations, where, among other things, she allegedly listed the phone number to her city council office on a business card for her private law practice, having staff members driving her to court appearances on city time, even failing to cooperate with investigators and lying under oath. Some pretty serious stuff. And while the charges were ultimately dropped after investigators failed to find sufficient evidence to back up these claims, the charges still took a hit to Jolanda's reputation, and she ended up losing re-election that November. But despite this, Jolanda would make a comeback just a couple years later, where in 2015 she won a seat on the Houston School Board, and while she ran unsuccessfully for the Harris Council Tax Assessor Collector in 2020, losing in the primary there, Jolanda would find her next big promotion in 2022, where she ran for and won a seat on the Texas State Legislature, running as a Democrat, and becoming the first openly gay black person elected to that body. And while she has used that position effectively to advocate for progressive policy goals, she once again faced controversy in March of 2023, where it came out that all 3 of her full-time staff members had resigned due to her creating an unprofessional work environment, where among the major charges was that she covered up a relationship between her 31-year-old son and a 26-year-old office intern, which not only gave her son access and influence in the office to where he was effectively serving as a political advisor to Jolanda, but also created a power imbalance that made a lot of staffers feel that there were no boundaries between their work lives and their personal lives. So on the whole, Jolanda's political career has been interesting to say the least, where on one hand she proved that being on Survivor can be a resume builder, at least in some capacity, and she has mostly been successful in climbing the political ladder in the state of Texas. But on the other hand, Jolanda has been caught up in plenty of controversy throughout the years that has gotten her into plenty of trouble, not too dissimilar from what she saw on the Oolong tribe. It'd be another couple years before we see another Survivor player attempt to make their bid, and that is one of the biggest names in all Survivor, but we have Rupert Boneham. Rupert is very much an icon of old school Survivor, having played in multiple seasons, even winning America's Tribal Council and $1 million to go along with it. And winning that fan vote must have been in the back of Rupert's mind, as in 2011 he announced that he was running for the governor of Indiana, running under the Libertarian Party. Now, despite Rupert not being your typical political candidate, he did have some experience with community service, where he used parts of his winnings from Survivor to open his own charity to help troubled teens, and he also got the endorsement from the chair of the Libertarian Party, who said that his nomination would be a great asset to the party. And considering that he was running unopposed in the primary, Rupert was able to get the nomination, setting up a general election matchup between the Democrat John Gregg and Republican Mike Pence. Yes, that Mike Pence. The race drew quite a bit of buzz, and Rupert even appeared in a televised debate aired on C-SPAN, which led to probably one of the most bizarre images you'll ever see of Rupert shaking hands with a future vice president. Though considering he was a third-party candidate, Rupert was largely viewed as a long shot, not seen as a serious contender to win the race, where a lot of polls only had him getting around 5 or 6%, and sure enough, he ultimately lost to Mike Pence, only getting around 4% of the vote, or 102,000 votes, which obviously is not that impressive at the end of the day, until you realize that there are 100,000 people out there who saw Rupert Bonham's name on the ballot and thought, yep, that's my guy. So while it's disappointing to see Rupert come up short by the end of it, his bid for governor remains one of the most interesting chapters in Survivor history, where considering that Rupert was already one of the biggest names in all Survivor, the fact that he also tried to parlay that into a political career is interesting to say the least. Now admittedly there's not much to say about the next couple people, so I'll try to summarize them briefly. So next up we have Laura Moret, who played on Survivor Samoa and Blood vs. Water, and is probably best known for being voted out by her own daughter. That's something. But in 2016, Laura saw a key opportunity to snag a seat on the Oregon House of Representatives, running as a Republican and challenging an incumbent Democrat. She was able to get the nomination, but ultimately lost the general election, losing by around 6 percentage points. Next up we have Eliza Orlins, a bit of a bigger name who played on Vanuatu and Micronesia, the latter of which being her more notable run where she tried to play a stick as an immunity idol, and later almost caused a tie at the final tribal, which is something to say the least. But despite these mishaps, Eliza went on to have a pretty successful law career, and in 2020 she ran for the Manhattan District Attorney, running as a Democrat. And at the time, this got a lot of publicity due to her being this pretty big character. However, she really struggled to stand out in a pretty crowded field of other progressives. She wasn't really taken that seriously as a candidate, didn't really get much endorsements or funding, and she ultimately finished in 7th place in the primary, getting just over 4% of the vote. And finally, probably one of the more recent cases of a Survivor player running for office, we have Clarence Black from Survivor Africa. Clarence was best remembered on the show for being caught up in Beangate, a controversy that kind of made him a pariah on the tribe, and admittedly, I think he was treated pretty unfairly on that season, but he was ultimately taken out at the merge, with him being on the bottom for pretty much his entire run. And despite him remaining in the limelight for a lot of his time after Survivor, just last year, Clarence ran for and won a seat on his local city council, which I think is pretty impressive there. So on the whole, these cases are all pretty brief. I don't really have much information to say about them beyond them running for office, but I still think they were at least worthy of mention here. So with that, we can jump back just a few years for our next player on the board, and that is Nick Wilson. Nick was a pretty notable figure at the time, playing on David vs. Goliath, a fan versus favorite season, and Nick was fittingly placed on the David tribe due to his rough upbringing from rural Kentucky, and was largely an underdog during the course of the season, where he started off almost being the first boot, but eventually scraped his way into a dominant alliance, and being a pretty dominant figure within that alliance. Now, while it does crumble towards the end game, he's able to fittingly take down the Goliaths, winning some immunity challenges along the way, getting to final 3 against 2 other Goliaths, and being the first winner in this video to talk about here. And he was later brought back for Winners of War as well, where admittedly he did take a hit due to him coming off as a bit weird and creepy, but still played an impressive game all things considered, getting all the way to the final 7 there. And with his resume as a Survivor winner and as a public defender, Nick decided to enter the public stage in 2022, running for an open seat on the Kentucky House of Representatives, getting endorsed by the outgoing Republican incumbent, and sailing his way to election, where admittedly he faced no opposition, but regardless, it was a pretty interesting time in Survivor history seeing Nick fight a good fight and go down to Frankfurt, at least at first. While many in the Survivor community were initially amused by Nick being elected to office and representing Survivor in a statewide legislature, it wasn't long before he faced controversy, where in March of 2023, he supported a bill that banned gender affirming care in the state of Kentucky and included a whole litany of anti-LGBT provisions, a bill that ultimately passed, I should add. And overnight, Nick became persona non grata in the Survivor community, where he was called out by many fans and former players for taking a stand on a high-profile issue. And not helping matters was another incident that happened just this year, where Nick filed a bill that would have removed first cousins from the state's big mistake laws. He later withdrew the bill and issued a statement saying that this was a mistake and that he would refile a new bill that would contain the first cousins provision in the law. Though considering that Nick had already made himself a donkey in the Survivor community, this incident just added fuel to that fire. So on the whole, I would say Nick's trajectory across Survivor and politics has been interesting to say the least, where there was a time where Nick was seemingly well liked, where while he wasn't the flashiest character on his season, he was still a competent player and someone that played an impressive game, fulfilling the David being Goliath narrative. But as we saw through his rise to politics, it very much encapsulates the notion that you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. But with that, we move to our final player in this video, and funnily enough, this player is also named Nick, but we are talking about Nick Brown from the Australian Outback. Now, Nick is an interesting case, as on one hand, he played during what many consider the most popular season in the show's run, coming at a point where Survivor was very much in the center of the cultural mainstream, where a lot of the people from that season ended up being celebrities in their own right after the show ended. But Nick was not one of those people, where despite him getting all the way to the final 7 and winning some challenges along the way, no one really cared about Nick after the show ended. He never returned for another season, no one really remembered him as being part of that season, and he was a member of the Kucha tribe, which produced many upstanding citizens, including Michael Skupin, Jeff Varner, Kimmy Kattenberg. It seemed like the cards were stacked against Nick from the offset, and one would think that he would just fade into the background and lived a normal, basic life. But instead, Nick ended up becoming a very successful lawyer after his time on Survivor, which in turn led to a pretty successful political career, where he ended up receiving numerous political appointments during his tenure, including Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington, General Counsel for Governor Jay Inslee, and the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington under the Biden administration, and now he is currently running for the Attorney General of Washington as a Democrat, where he managed to finish in the top 2 in the blanket primary moving on to the general election, and he is widely favored to win that race come November. And while we'll have to see how things end up turning out if he wins that election, it's still interesting seeing how Nick Brown is in many ways the opposite of Nick Wilson, both politically but also Survivor-wise, where both of them played in very different eras of the show. One is a winner, one is not a winner. One was painted as a David to take down the Goliath, another was the Goliath that Colby took down. One has been remembered for arguably the wrong reasons, while the other has been forgotten for arguably the right reasons. And yet despite these differences, we now have 2 Nicks who played Survivor and are now probably going to be major political forces within their respective states moving forward. And while they were not the first Survivor players to launch political careers after their appearance on the show, based off the success of others, they will definitely not be the last. So all in all, I know that this is not my usual type of video, but I still think that this was a pretty interesting concept to go over here, talking about this history and what we may expect moving forward from other future players in their political pursuits. But with all that out of the way, there you go. That is the video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps with the channel. Now, I will go back to my normal content in the future, making Survivor and Hell's Kitchen power rankings, so you can look forward to that. I am on Patreon and also have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.